The chamber of the Galactic Council was older than most civilizations that sat within it. It floated at the heart of Nexus Prime, a station built by species that had turned to dust long before the first human looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. The walls were made of a metal that no living being could name anymore, and they curved upward into a dome that showed the endless black of space through panels of transparent crystal. 47 species had sent their representatives here today, and they filled the tiered seats like a garden of strange flowers, each one different from the last. Ambassador of the collective stood at the central podium. They were tall and thin, with skin that shifted colors depending on their mood. Right now, skin was a deep shade of satisfied purple. The vote had just concluded, and the results were exactly what the ambassador had wanted. The human containment resolution had passed with an overwhelming majority. Only 3 species had abstained. None had voted against it. His voice echoed through the chamber as the final words were spoken. Humanity was to be confined to their home system effective immediately. All human vessels currently operating beyond the boundaries of Sol would be impounded by Council security forces. All human colonies on other worlds would be evacuated within 30 standard cycles. All trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and diplomatic arrangements with the human species were hereby declared void. The chamber was quiet as the weight of these words settled over the assembled representatives. A few of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Most did not. They had voted for this, after all. They believed it was necessary. The human delegation sat in a small section near the back of the chamber. There were only 5 of them. The council had never given humanity more seats than that, despite the fact that human populations now lived on dozens of worlds across the galaxy. The delegation was led by a woman named Laura Finch, who had served as humanity's chief ambassador to the council for the past 12 years. She was in her 50s, with gray streaking through her brown hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of long years spent in difficult conversations. She was known among the other diplomats as someone who never raised her voice and never lost her temper. Some of them thought this made her weak. Others were not so sure. Laura Finch listened to the verdict without any visible reaction. Her face remained calm and her hands stayed folded in her lap. The 4 humans beside her looked more troubled, but they followed her lead and kept their silence. When finished speaking, the ambassador turned toward the human section with an expression that was clearly meant to be gracious, but came across as something closer to smug. He asked if the human delegation wished to make a statement in response to the council's decision. Laura Finch rose from her seat. She was not a tall woman, and she did not have the dramatic presence that some diplomats cultivated. She looked, in fact, like exactly what she was, a tired bureaucrat who had spent too many years in rooms like this one, fighting battles that nobody else seemed to notice. She thanked the council for allowing humanity to speak. Her voice was soft but clear, and it carried easily through the chamber's excellent acoustics. She said that humanity understood the concerns that had led to this resolution. She acknowledged that humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago. She recognized that older species had legitimate reasons to be cautious about a younger civilization that had spread so quickly. Several of the council members nodded at these words. This was the reasonable response they had expected. Humans were always so eager to please, so desperate to fit in. It was one of the things that made them useful, and also one of the things that made them easy to dismiss. Laura Finch paused for a moment, as if considering her next words carefully. Then she asked a single question. She asked whether the council would like humanity to provide a formal acknowledgement of existing human contributions to galactic infrastructure before the transition period began. She said this would help ensure a smooth handover of responsibilities and prevent any unnecessary disruptions. His purple skin flickered with a hint of orange, which among the indicated mild annoyance. The ambassador replied that this would not be necessary. Whatever small services humans had provided to the galaxy could easily be replaced. The elder races had built civilizations long before humanity learned to chip stones into tools. They would manage perfectly well without human assistance. Laura Finch inclined her head politely. She said that she understood. She thanked the council again for their time and their consideration. Then she gathered her delegation and walked toward the exit. The council watched them go. A few of the representatives felt a small twinge of something that might have been guilt, but they pushed it aside. This was for the best. Humanity had grown too fast and spread too far. They needed to be contained before they became a real problem. The resolution would ensure that the natural order of the galaxy remained intact. None of them noticed that Laura Finch was smiling as she left the chamber. It was a small smile, barely visible. It did not reach her eyes, which remained as calm and unreadable as they had been throughout the entire proceeding. But it was there, turning up the corners of her mouth just slightly as she walked through the great doors and into the corridor beyond. Her deputy, a young man named Marsh, fell into step beside her. He was clearly struggling to contain his emotions. His hands were clenched at his sides and his jaw was tight with anger. He asked Laura what they were supposed to do now. He asked how they were supposed to fight this. He asked if she had any plan at all. Laura Finch kept walking. Her footsteps echoed softly on the ancient metal floor. She did not answer his questions directly. Instead, she told him something that her grandmother had told her a long time ago, back when she was just a little girl growing up in a small town that no longer existed on a planet that now belonged to someone else. She said that her grandmother used to have a garden. It was nothing special, just some vegetables and flowers in the backyard. But her grandmother tended that garden every single day, even when she was tired, even when she was sick, even when it seemed like the whole world was falling apart around her. And when people asked her why she bothered, she always gave the same answer. She said that the most important things grow slowly. You plant the seeds and you water them and you wait. And then one day, before anyone realizes what has happened, the garden is everywhere. Marsh did not understand what this had to do with their current situation. He said as much, his voice frustrated and confused. Laura Finch just smiled again, that same small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She said that he would understand soon enough. Everyone would understand soon enough. The moment had already elapsed. The seeds had already been planted, and now, at last, it was time for the harvest to begin. The first reports came in exactly 24 hours after the council's vote. They were small things at first, barely worth noticing. A transaction that would not process, a door that would not open, a message that could not be delivered. The kind of minor inconveniences that happened every day in a galaxy filled with billions of beings and trillions of machines. But then the small things started adding up. The Trade Federation was the first to realize that something was seriously wrong. There were a mercantile species who had built their entire civilization around commerce. They traded everything from raw minerals to finished technologies to information itself. Their financial networks connected thousands of worlds and facilitated transactions worth more than most species could even comprehend. When those networks froze, it was like watching the blood stop flowing through the veins of a living creature. A senior administrator named New stared at his display screens in growing horror. Every single transaction in the entire network was stuck in a pending state. The system was not crashed. It was simply waiting for something that was not coming. New summoned his best technicians and demanded answers. They worked through the night, tracing the problem through layer after layer of complex code. Finally, a junior technician found the source. It was something called the Prometheus Protocol, a security architecture that had been implemented during a major system upgrade 18 years ago. The protocol required periodic verification from a central server to confirm that the network was operating legitimately. Without that verification, no transactions could be completed. The verification servers were located on Earth. Nu felt something cold settle into his stomach. He asked his technicians if they could bypass the protocol. They told him that they could try, but the protocol was woven deeply into the foundation of the entire system. Removing it would take months, possibly years. And during that time, no transactions could be processed. The Trade Federation, one of the wealthiest powers in the galaxy, was suddenly unable to buy or sell anything at all. On the other side of the galaxy, the agricultural world of Four was experiencing a different kind of crisis. Four was a beautiful planet covered in vast plains of golden grain that fed billions of beings across dozens of systems. The planet's atmosphere was not naturally suited for the crops that grew there, so it had been modified centuries ago by a species that no longer existed. Giant atmospheric processors dotted the landscape, maintaining the precise balance of gases that the plants needed to thrive. Those processors had stopped working. The who lived on the planet gathered in frightened crowds, watching the status lights on the nearest processor blink from green to red. Their leaders tried to reassure them. They said that technicians were being dispatched from the capital. They said that the problem would be fixed soon. They said that there was no need to panic. But when the technicians arrived, they discovered something that none of them had ever bothered to learn before. The atmospheric processors were old, far older than anyone had realized. The original builders had vanished from history long ago. The only people who knew how to maintain the machines were the contractors who had been servicing them for the past 100 years. Those contractors were human. Specifically, they were employees of a small engineering firm based on Mars. The firm had been quiet and unassuming, never drawing attention to itself. It had simply done its job, year after year, keeping the processors running smoothly. And now that the humans were being expelled from galactic space, the firm had withdrawn its technicians and locked its proprietary maintenance software behind encryption that no one else could break. They stared at the frozen processors and wondered how long their crops could survive without proper atmospheric regulation. The answer, their scientists told them, was approximately 3 weeks. Meanwhile, in the military headquarters of the hegemony, a very different kind of panic was spreading. There were a proud warrior species who had been among the most enthusiastic supporters of the human containment resolution. They had argued loudly and repeatedly that humans were dangerous, that humans were unpredictable, that humans needed to be stopped before they became a threat to galactic security. Now their entire communication network was refusing to function. The High Commander stood in the center of the command room, watching her officers struggle with consoles that displayed nothing but error messages. She demanded to know what was happening. Her communications chief, a veteran officer named, looked up at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. It was fear. Explained that the network kept asking for authorization from someone called Supervisor Hayes. The system would not accept any other authorization. It would not process any commands. It would not transmit any messages. It simply waited, endlessly patient, for Supervisor Hayes to approve its operations. The High Commander asked who this Supervisor Hayes was, told her that he had spent the past 6 hours researching that very question. There was no one named Hayes in the military. There never had been. But 40 years ago, when the communication network was being designed and built, there had been a human consultant named Daniel Hayes. He had been a software engineer, a quiet man who had spent 3 years working alongside technicians to create the most advanced military communication system in the quadrant. When the project was completed, he had returned to human space and was never heard from again. Apparently, he had left a piece of himself behind. The High Commander felt rage building inside her chest. She ordered her technicians to remove the authorization requirement by force. They tried. The system responded by locking down completely. Now not only could they not send messages, they could not even access their own databases. Across the galaxy, Similar scenes were playing out in every corner of civilized space. Transportation networks ground to a halt when navigation beacons stopped transmitting their signals. Medical facilities lost access to databases containing centuries of research. Power grids flickered and failed when their automated maintenance routines encountered checkpoints that only human engineers could clear. The Galactic Council received these reports with growing unease. Ambassador dismissed the first few as isolated incidents, random malfunctions that had nothing to do with the resolution. By the end of the second day, Even could no longer pretend that this was coincidence. An emergency session was called. The chamber that had been so confident just 48 hours ago was now filled with frightened voices and angry accusations. Representatives demanded to know why they had not been warned about humanity's role in critical infrastructure. They demanded to know who was responsible for allowing this to happen. They demanded to know what could be done to fix it. No one had any answers. Somewhere in human space, in a small office on a quiet street in a city that had been built by human hands on human soil, Laura Finch sat at her desk and read the reports coming in from across the galaxy. Her expression was calm, almost serene. Beside her, Marsh watched the same reports with wide eyes and an open mouth. He asked her how long she had known about this. She told him that she had not known the specifics, but she had known, in a general sense, that this day would come eventually. Everyone who had been paying attention had known. Asked why the council had not been paying attention, Laura smiled her small smile and said that was the most human question anyone could ask. By the second week, the galaxy was learning what it truly meant to depend on something you had never bothered to understand. The disruptions had grown beyond inconvenience. They had become emergencies. They had become crises. They had become the kind of problems that kept leaders awake at night and made ordinary people wonder if their world was about to end. The medical stations orbiting the dying star of Seven were perhaps the most desperate case of all. These stations had been built 3 centuries ago as a last refuge for the terminally ill. Beings from dozens of species came here when their own worlds could not save them. They were placed in cryogenic suspension, their bodies frozen in time while they waited for cures that might take generations to develop. Over 2 million patients floated in those silent chambers, dreaming whatever dreams the frozen dream. When the power systems began to fail, the station administrators felt terror unlike anything they had ever known. The chief administrator was an elderly named Mora. She had dedicated her entire life to this station and to the patients in her care. Now she stood in the central control room and watched the power readings drop, percentage point by percentage point, hour by hour. The backup systems had already failed. The emergency protocols had triggered some kind of lockdown that none of her technicians could bypass. The main reactors were still functioning, but they were operating at minimal capacity, and no one could figure out how to restore them to full power. At the current rate of decline, the cryogenic chambers would begin to fail within 72 hours. 2 million beings would die, not because of any disease, but because a machine that had worked perfectly for 300 years had suddenly decided to stop cooperating. Moore had tried everything. She had contacted the original manufacturers of the power systems, only to discover that the company had been bought by a human corporation 50 years ago. She had reached out to technical experts across the quadrant, but none of them had ever worked on systems like these. She had even tried to contact humans directly, despite the Council's communication blackout, but her messages went unanswered. In desperation, she had ordered her security teams to detain any humans they could find in the surrounding systems. There were not many. Most humans had already begun their journey back to Sol, following the Council's decree. But a few remained, caught in transit or unwilling to leave their lives behind. One of them was a young man named Chris. Chris was 26 years old. He had grown up on a mining colony in the outer reaches of human space and had trained as a maintenance technician because it was the only career that his family could afford to send him to school for. He had been working on a cargo hauler for the past 3 years, fixing broken equipment and keeping the old ship running despite its many complaints. He was not an expert in anything. He was not important. He was just a young man trying to make his way in a universe that had suddenly decided it did not want him. When the security forces brought him before Mora, he had no idea what was happening. He had been pulled off his ship without explanation and transported to the station under armed guard. Now he stood in the control room, surrounded by desperate aliens who were looking at him like he was supposed to have all the answers. Moore explained the situation in rapid, frightened words. She told him about the power failure and the cryogenic chambers and the 2 million lives that hung in the balance. She told him that the systems had been designed by humans and maintained by humans, and that only humans could fix them. She told him that he had to help them. He had to save those people. Chris listened to all of this with growing disbelief. He looked at the control panels with their blinking red warnings and their incomprehensible alien script. He looked at the technicians who were watching him with desperate hope in their eyes. He looked at Mora, who was clearly on the verge of tears. Then he told her the truth. He said that he was sorry. He said that he wished he could help. He said that if there was anything he could do, he would do it without hesitation. But the systems she was talking about were not something he knew anything about. He was a maintenance technician on a cargo ship. He fixed water recyclers and air filters, and occasionally the engines when they decided to be difficult. He had never even seen power systems like the ones on this station. Morris' expression shifted from desperation to anger. She demanded to know why he was refusing to help. She accused him of holding the lives of 2 million innocent beings hostage for political reasons. She threatened him with imprisonment, with execution, with punishments that her species had not used in generations. Chris did not flinch. He simply repeated what he had already said. He was not refusing to help. He was unable to help. The knowledge she needed was not in his head. It was in databases and documentation that existed back on Earth, held by the engineering teams who had actually designed these systems. He did not have access to that information. No one outside of human space had access to that information. He suggested, very carefully, that perhaps the Council might want to reconsider its communication blackout. Mora stared at him for a long moment. The anger in her eyes faded, replaced by something that looked almost like understanding. She realized that this young human was not her enemy. He was caught in the same trap that she was, the same trap that everyone was caught in. She ordered her guards to release him. Then she contacted the Galactic Council and told them exactly what she thought of their resolution and exactly what would happen to 2 million innocent lives if they did not find a way to fix this situation immediately. She was not the only one making such calls. Across the galaxy, similar confrontations were taking place. Human engineers and doctors and technicians found themselves suddenly valuable and simultaneously powerless. They were not being obstructive. They were not playing political games. They simply could not help because the knowledge and the tools and the authorization codes they needed were all locked away in a place that no one could reach. The Council began to receive thousands of messages every hour. Some were pleas for help. Some were demands for action. Some were simply screams of frustration from beings who had suddenly discovered that their entire civilization was built on foundations they did not control. And through it all, the humans kept saying the same thing. They said that they wanted to help. They said that they had always wanted to help, but helping required cooperation. Helping required trust. Helping required treating humans as partners rather than servants. The galaxy was beginning to learn a very hard lesson about what happened when you took things for granted. Laura Finch returned to the council chambers exactly 30 days after the vote that had condemned her species to exile. She had not been summoned. She had not requested permission. She simply appeared, walking through the corridors of Nexus Prime as if she belonged there, which in a sense she did. The security checkpoints did not stop her. They could not stop her. The systems that controlled them recognized her biometric signature and opened every door she approached. The guards who manned those checkpoints watched her pass with confusion and growing alarm, but their attempts to override the systems failed completely. The station's security network had been installed by human contractors 60 years ago. It knew who Laura Finch was. It had been waiting for her. She entered the council chamber through the main doors, which swung open at her approach like they were welcoming an old friend. The assembled representatives fell silent as she walked down the central aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. She looked tired. She looked calm. She looked like someone who had finally reached the end of a very long journey. Ambassador was the first to find words. The skin had turned a mottled shade of gray, which among that species indicated extreme stress. Demanded to know how Laura Finch had gained entry to the station. The ambassador demanded to know by what authority she presumed to enter these chambers. The ambassador demanded answers, explanations, accountability. Laura Finch did not raise her voice. She did not make threats. She simply explained, in the same quiet tone she had always used, that she had walked through the front door. The door had recognized her and let her in. It had been programmed to do so by the human security team that had installed it all those years ago. She was sorry if this had caused any inconvenience. The chamber erupted in angry voices. Representatives shouted over each other, demanding that security remove this intruder immediately. Guards rushed forward, only to find that their weapons would not fire and their restraints would not lock. The systems that controlled those tools had the same problem as everything else in the galaxy. They were waiting for authorization that would never come. Laura Finch waited for the chaos to subside. When the shouting finally faded into frustrated silence, she reached into her bag and a single data tablet. She held it up so that everyone could see it, then placed it on the podium in front of her. She said that she had not come here to make threats. She had not come here to gloat or to demand revenge for the way her species had been treated. She had come here to present the council with information that they needed to understand before any further decisions were made. The tablet contained an inventory, nothing more and nothing less, just a list. Laura Finch activated the display, and a holographic projection filled the air above her head. Words and numbers scrolled past, line after line after line, more than any being could read in a lifetime. But the categories were clear enough for everyone to understand. Power systems designed, built, or maintained by human engineers. Communication networks that relied on human-created protocols. Transportation infrastructure that used human navigation algorithms. Medical databases compiled from human research. Agricultural technologies adapted from human innovations. Manufacturing processes developed in human laboratories. Financial architectures secured by human encryption. The list went on and on. Laura Finch let it run for several minutes before she spoke again. She explained that humanity had not set out to conquer the galaxy. They had not planned some grand conspiracy to make themselves indispensable. They had simply done what humans had always done throughout their entire history. They had solved problems. When they needed a more secure financial network, human programmers had built one for them. When they needed someone to maintain their atmospheric processors, human engineers had volunteered for the job. When they wanted a state-of-the-art military communication system, human consultants had helped design it. When any species, anywhere in the galaxy, had a problem that needed fixing, humans had shown up with tools and knowledge and a willingness to work. They had not asked for recognition. They had not demanded special treatment. They had simply made themselves useful, because being useful was the only way a young species could survive in a galaxy dominated by civilizations that were older and more powerful and generally uninterested in newcomers. Over the course of 2 centuries, this simple strategy had woven humanity into the fabric of galactic civilization so deeply that no one could separate them anymore, not without tearing everything apart in the process. Laura Finch paused and looked around the chamber. She saw fear in some faces and anger in others. She saw confusion and disbelief, and the dawning realization of just how badly the Council had miscalculated. She said that humanity was not asking the Council to reverse its decision out of mercy or guilt or political pressure. The decision stood. If the Council truly wanted humans to return to their home system and never leave again, humans would do so. They would honor the resolution that had been passed against them. But they would take their expertise with them. Every human engineer would leave their post. Every human consultant would end their contract. Every human-designed system would be left without the people who understood how it worked. The galaxy could certainly rebuild everything from scratch. The elder races were wise and capable, and had built great civilizations long before humanity existed. It would simply take time, perhaps centuries, perhaps longer, and in the meantime the lights would go out and the ships would stop flying and the crops would wither in fields that could no longer sustain them. Laura Finch smiled her small smile, the one that never quite reached her eyes. She said that the choice was entirely up to the Council. Humanity would accept whatever decision was made, but she thought it might be helpful if everyone understood exactly what that decision would mean. Then she bowed her head respectfully and waited for the Council to respond. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that chamber had ever heard. The silence in the Council chamber lasted for a very long time. It stretched and deepened until it seemed to have weight, pressing down on every representative who sat in those ancient seats. No one wanted to be the first to speak. No one wanted to acknowledge what had just happened. Finally, Ambassador broke the silence. This voice was quieter than it had been before, stripped of its usual confidence and authority. Asked a simple question. The ambassador asked what humanity wanted. Laura Finch did not hesitate. She had been waiting for this question for a very long time. She said that humanity wanted exactly what it had always wanted, from the very first day that human ships had ventured beyond their home system and made contact with galactic civilization. Humans wanted to be treated as equals. They wanted to have a voice in the decisions that affected their species. They wanted to build and trade and explore alongside everyone else, not as servants or junior partners or convenient labor, but as full members of the galactic community. She said that this was not a new demand. Human representatives had been making this request for 2 centuries. They had been polite about it. They had been patient. They had followed every rule and respected every tradition and done everything that was asked of them. And in return, they had been dismissed and ignored and treated like children who did not deserve a seat at the adult table. Laura Finch looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives. She spoke to them not with anger, but with something closer to sadness. She said that humanity had not planned any of this. There was no secret conspiracy, no grand strategy hatched in hidden rooms by shadowy figures. Humans had simply done what they always did. They saw problems that needed solving and they solved them. They saw opportunities to be helpful and they took them. They made themselves useful because being useful was in their nature. Some species conquered through military force. Some species dominated through economic power. Some species achieved influence through ancient traditions and accumulated wisdom. Humans achieved their place in the galaxy by being the ones who showed up when something was broken and fixed it without being asked. And over time, without anyone noticing, without anyone paying attention, humanity had become the thread that held everything together. Laura Finch said that the Council could have seen this coming if they had been watching. The signs were everywhere for anyone who cared to look, but no one had been looking. Humans were beneath notice. Humans were unimportant. Humans were just the workers who maintained the systems that kept civilization running, and no one ever thought about the workers until the systems stopped working. By the time anyone thought to look, the moment had already elapsed. The integration was complete. Humanity was not just part of galactic civilization anymore. Humanity was the foundation on which that civilization stood. The council representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many of them were remembering decisions they had made, votes they had cast, words they had spoken about the human species. They were seeing those choices in a new light now, and they did not like what they saw. One by one, they began to speak. The debates lasted for hours, then days. Accusations were made and blame was assigned and rejected. Old grievances were aired and new alliances were formed. The political machinery of the galaxy ground forward, slowly and painfully, toward a conclusion that everyone had already accepted but no one wanted to admit. In the end, the human containment resolution was rescinded. The vote was not unanimous. Some species refused to accept what had happened. They voted against the reversal out of pride or anger or simple stubbornness. But they were vastly outnumbered by those who had looked at the reality of the situation and decided that they would rather swallow their pride than watch their civilizations collapse. New treaties were drafted. Human representatives were given permanent seats on 17 different governing bodies. Trade agreements were renegotiated to reflect the true value of human contributions. Cultural exchange programs were established. Educational initiatives were launched to help other species understand human technologies that they had been using for generations without knowing how they worked. It was not a perfect solution. There was still resentment, still suspicion, still the memory of centuries of mistreatment that would take a long time to heal. But it was a beginning. Laura Finch returned to Earth as something that she had never wanted to be. She was called a hero. She was offered positions of power and influence. She was asked to lead, to guide, to shape the future of human galactic relations for generations to come. She refused all of it. In her final public statement before retiring to private life, she said only that humanity had not won this confrontation through strength or cunning. They had not outwitted the Council or defeated them in some kind of cosmic chess match. They had simply been themselves, for 200 years, doing the work that needed to be done. She said that she hoped the galaxy would remember the lesson that had been learned here. She hoped that the other species would understand that every being, no matter how small or insignificant they might seem, has value. She hoped that the powerful would learn to respect the workers who kept their systems running, and the builders who maintained their cities, and the quiet, unnoticed people who made civilization possible. But she suspected, with the quiet wisdom of someone who had spent her entire life watching people fail to learn from their mistakes, that they probably would not remember. And when they forgot, humanity would be there again. They would be in the background, unnoticed and underestimated. They would be fixing the machines and writing the code and maintaining the infrastructure that everyone else took for granted. They would be planting seeds that would not bloom for generations. It was not conquest, it was not strategy, it was not even revenge. It was just what humans did. And somewhere, in a small garden on a quiet street, in a city that had been built by human hands, new seeds were already beginning to grow.